Hey everybody, I just want to take a few minutes and go over our assignment that's due this week on Final Project Milestone 2, drafted the judicial systems. And so this is the second part of our Milestone series, and I hope you've had a chance to take a look at the final grading rubric and assignment guidelines, and I think you'll discover that each of these is building upon one another. And so hopefully you've had a chance to look at my comments and feedback to you on Milestone 1. So do the tweaking, clean it up, set it aside on your desktop somewhere. And then as we begin to wrap up this particular milestone 2, then you can copy, paste, clean up, and then add that on to your final project. As we get towards the end, there'll be a couple areas that we will have to specifically discuss that aren't going to show up on any of these milestone type assignments. So it's critical that you understand what those are. And as we get closer, I will point those out to you. One of them, for example, is on the final project, there's something about sentencing guidelines. So we don't really talk about that per se, but I do have a lecture on that that's forthcoming. So throughout the next couple of weeks, you'll be getting that information. All right. So again, please make sure you take a look at the final grading rubric as we get closer, and realize that in the final grading rubric, there is an exemplary rating and what is required to get an exemplary rating. For these milestone projects, the highest you can get is proficient, which is good. But to get the exemplary rating, you're going to have to provide some specific evidence or details that really go beyond identifying a particular term or concept or something like that. Okay, and so I've tried to give you some pointers in those papers. So this week, our milestone 2 is in terms of the judicial administration, is really going to be focusing on a couple different things. It's going to be focusing on calendaring and docketing. It's going to be focusing on courtroom personnel, and then it's going to touch a little bit on venue. And so I do want to take a few minutes to go over those with you and give you some ideas to what we're looking for. I think it's important this week, though, that you really pay attention to these reading resources, because these are going to help you. For example, the model continuance policy, our scenario, the defendant's attorneys, the bank robber's attorneys asked for a 4-month continuance. So the question ultimately becomes whether or not that's reasonable, considering the court is backlogged. Well, take a look at this model continuance policy. That'll give you some ideas, and you can reference that in your response. And that will give you some potential resources that you can use in terms of what is a fair recommendation in terms of a continuance based on the fact pattern for our particular case. All right. Because I think it's important to understand that, the judges are going to be dealing with a couple different things. There's constitutional rights to a speedy trial, but there's also the need to make sure that as a defense attorney that you have received ample opportunities from the court to investigate the allegations against your client, so you can offer the best possible defense to the charges that they're facing. Okay, so please take a look at these reading resources. They are going to help you a lot. The docket management program will help you out. Case law management will help you out. And so feel free to reference these as part of your milestone 2 assignment. Okay, so let's just jump right in and take a look at the rubric here. Let me click it open, and hopefully it'll show up on the screen. There we go. Let me make a minor adjustment here on my end. Okay, so we have our scenario. The scenario hasn't changed. Our bank robbers have been arrested. Remember, they're arrested in another jurisdiction, and we'll talk about the impact that that might have on venue here in just a minute. But take a look at the scenario. Again, the defense attorneys want to propose a continuance so they can evaluate their client's culpability, the evidence that's being used to attempt to prosecute them. So I think it's important that You again reread the scenario, get an understanding as to what exactly is being asked as we prepare to answer some of these questions. So the first thing you have to look at is analyze how federal, state, and local courts calendar and docket cases. Are these processes effective in promoting efficiency, defend the response? So you can go back to those handouts earlier that I referenced that talk about case management flow and calendaring and docketing cases. Now, many court systems, larger court systems, use a means to support electronic filing of cases, e-file, for example, electronic filing. They use technology as a means to keep track of cases and so forth. Some local courts, especially in rural areas or your courts of limited jurisdiction, such as your traffic courts or your misdemeanor courts, might not have reached that level of technology, and many of the processes that take place at the local level may still require an attorney or a member of his or her staff to go to the courthouse to file necessary documents. All right. I think if you take a look at any federal court website for the U.S. District Court, you can take the U.S. District Court for your area. If you go to their website, you'll find that they have local rules in terms of calendaring and docketing and continuances that might be helpful to you. All right. So again, I think the federal government is, in terms of federal courts, they use a lot of technology in terms of operating their calendar and their dockets, which is important. A lot of state courts, especially those that are in big urban areas, use the same level of technology. Again, some of the more local courts in some rural areas or not so populated areas may not have reached that level of technology in terms of how they do their calendar and docketing. Okay, so you're going to use that first couple of outside resources on case management flow and docket management programs, I think, to help you here. So take a look at that, read what it says. It'll discuss some of the processes, and then you can determine whether or not those things such as e-filing and so forth allow the judicial system to be a more effective instrument in justice. So you can take a look at that. Okay. So in this case, so number B is describe how the calendaring and continuance of the scenario would be handled differently in the state system versus the federal system, defending response. So we go back to calendaring. Calendaring has to do with assigning cases to the courts. Okay, so if you look at a court calendar, it basically says what that court will be doing. So for example, maybe you're in trial all week, so it'll have People versus Jones trial. Okay, it's a jury trial, whatever the case may be. That's the calendar. Some calendars, judges may be meeting with attorneys trying to reach a disposition on a civil case, or maybe there's a motion to squash evidence that's on the calendar, those type of things. Now, the thing I think that you'll find uniquely different between federal and state courts, at least my experience, and some states may not operate this way, but under the federal system, once you're assigned a judge for a particular case, you have that judge for the life of that case, whether it is a civil suit or whether it is a criminal case. Under the federal system, a judge tends to have that case from beginning to end. That allows, obviously, the court to become very intimate and familiar with the details of the case as they try to reach a resolution and or as they proceed to trial. So the calendaring part of that is that it tends to be a little bit more efficient in terms of how the court operates. Also, if you're the judge assigned to a particular case from beginning to end, you're probably going to be a little bit more hands-on in terms of trying to reach a disposition with this case, whether it's a criminal or whether it is a civil case. I have been in federal court for civil actions and have had more than one meeting with a judge in terms of trying to resolve a particular civil suit against the city. And so the judges are actively involved in trying to resolve it. I think most courts would prefer, if possible, to avoid a jury trial because jury trials take up court time. And obviously your calendar is going to be limited because you're in a trial, but everyone has a right to the day in court. But when you actually realize how many cases go through the criminal justice system and how many people actually have their case heard by a jury, it's not as much as you would think. Okay, so again, here you're going to be looking at how it's going to be handled differently. At the state level, my experience has typically been that you may have one judge that might do what we refer to as a preliminary hearing or determine whether or not there's sufficient evidence on the felony case to hold somebody to trial. And then you may have another judge involved in the trial itself or hearing some other cases. In some states, they have what they call vertical prosecution, and that means that basically the attorney, the DA, has the case from beginning to end, whereas in some cases, in some states, the case might be handed off to different attorneys. So calendaring has to do with how a case is going to be handled, its appearances in courts, hence the word calendar. And so it's going to depend. As we have learned, state courts have a significant workload versus federal courts, so you can tie that into your issue of calendaring. So take a look at the resources available to you, and then come up with a response to this particular prompt. Next is the key role. I'm not going to go too much into that because you just did a paper on that. So you can identify who you think is a key role within the federal and state judicial system that impacts process most. In other words, who keeps things going, all right? And how does that particular person role that they play make for an efficient and effective judicial process? So you just finished a paper on that, so that should be beneficial to you. Next, we have F is determine the impact of venue on process of efficiency in this scenario, defend your response. So the thing I tried to bring out in some of your last milestone assignments was that this particular situation involves multiple jurisdictions. We have the jurisdiction in Washington, D.C. where the bank robbery occurred. We have the jurisdiction in another state where the bank robbers were caught and evidence was seized. So not only do we have to figure out how to get our bank robbers back to Washington, and it's, we usually have an extradition process because we're going from one state back to Washington, D.C., so we're traveling from one jurisdiction to another. We also have the issue of getting evidence back to Washington, D.C. We also have the issue of our witnesses, all right? And so the last thing you want in terms of running a court system is to have your witnesses travel out of state to go to court to find out that the case has been continued for whatever reason. Okay, so the fact that we're dealing with multiple jurisdictions, different law enforcement personnel from two different locations is going to add and impact the issue of venue. Okay, so these are things that courts have to be considerate of. So when continuances take place, what impact is that going to have on getting our witnesses to Washington, D.C. and so forth. So it's like being a conductor as a judge, orchestrating everything, trying to get everyone playing on the same sheet of music. And so when we do have a trial, it runs smoothly, witnesses aren't delayed, evidence is where it needs to be for the jury to access it and be properly introduced in the court. Okay. Finally, we look at the issue of continuance, and hopefully that that document on the model continuance policy will help you out. So you can take a look at that. In some states, for example, the idea that felony cases shouldn't drag out any longer than 180 days, except for some major type offenses like homicides and things such as that. But most felony cases should be resolved in 180 days. Ideally, the goal might be, for example, less than 140 days. That might be a goal, and preferably less than 90 days, depending on the type of case it is. A lot of felony cases are not that complicated. So when you evaluate whether or not 4-month continuances is a good thing or a bad thing based on our particular scenario, you can take a look at these things, that I just mentioned. Try to get it resolved at the most 180 days. Ideally, you want to get it done less than 90 days, but maybe 140 days might work. You can take a look at federal guidelines because federal guidelines tell us ideally when cases should be resolved. So you can take a look at one of the other resources we have in that heading as well. Okay, I hope that helps. If not, feel free to give me a holler. But again, read those resources. I think you'll find them useful. All right, Thanks. Have a good week. Bye.